So the labeling of narco-terrorists, again, a new term. Just yesterday, Maduro was labeled a terrorist. This is definitely setting the scene for whatever's next.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
The deepening ties between China, Russia and North Korea would certainly have some in Washington concerned.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
I'm Venetia Rainey and this is Battle Lines. It's Monday, 17th of November, 2025. The world is watching the Caribbean with bated breath, waiting to see if the US is about to go to war with a socialist enemy government. But this is 2025, not 1962, and it's Venezuela instead of Cuba in the US's crosshairs. With the arrival of the world's biggest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, the region is now seeing the largest military buildup since the Cuban Missile Crisis, half a century ago. It's been dubbed Operation Southern Spear and comprises nearly a dozen Navy ships, including the Ford aircraft carrier, 2 guided missile cruisers, 3 amphibious ships and 3 destroyers, plus about 15,000 troops at sea and on bases throughout the Caribbean. It's ostensibly all about combating narco-terrorists. Since September, the US has carried out at least 21 strikes on alleged drug trafficking ships, killing at least 80 people. But as we discussed previously on Battle Lines, many suspect regime change is the real goal, especially after news broke over the weekend that as of next Monday, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro will be formally designated a terrorist by the US. Donald Trump has accused him of being the head of drug smuggling gang Cartel de los Soles. Maduro denies that and says the US is fabricating a war against him. He's mobilized the entire Venezuelan army, just in case. So what exactly is going on? We'll be unpicking it all on today's episode of Battle Lines. Let's start with the 100,000-ton USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, which arrived in the Caribbean yesterday. Earlier, I spoke to Telegraph columnist Tom Sharpe, a former British Royal Navy officer who has previously served in the region tackling drug smugglers. I started by asking him what sort of firepower the Ford is packing and how significant its presence is in the Caribbean.
The firepower is kind of unlimited almost. The US carrier strike groups are probably the single largest gathering of conventional forces on the planet and have been since they were invented. I mean, the Nimitz is now 50 years old. So the Ford is the newest one. It's actually a new class. They will slowly replace the Nimitz, and they've got, sometimes up to 70 fast jets on board. But it's also not just the pointy stuff that they have. It's the whole bubble that goes around them, from logistics support to intelligence gathering. They've got a nuclear-powered submarine somewhere underneath there. It really is the complete fighting package. And perhaps up to 4,000 people across the task group. So, I mean, it's immense. But in terms of what it brings to Venezuela, that's hard to determine because there was already a big deck amphibious ship there, the Iwo Jima, with 8 ships. I mean, what we would consider a significant task group. That was there anyway. So the Ford dash, actually it hasn't been much of a dash. The Ford move across the Atlantic has had everyone scratching their heads. What's this for?
How many ships is in the Ford carrier strike group then? Just break that down for us.
At the moment, it appears to be the carrier. There'll be at least one submarine, probably just one. And then I think it's about 3 or 4 destroyers, depending on who's coming and going. They don't move around in a blob. Whenever you see the photos of ships in formation, that's always slightly misleading. So there's one en rotor, perhaps refueling. Generally speaking, a US carrier strike group has 1 cruiser, which is a slightly bigger version of a destroyer, but controls the air battle, and then 2 or 3 destroyers. And that's pretty much what we're seeing this time.
And what's on board the aircraft carrier? You mentioned lots of jets. Anything else?
Lots of airborne surveillance, lots of drones. The Americans are moving ahead quite fast on uncrewed equipment. They have the ability to strike. They have the ability to detect, to deter, which of course is perhaps what this mission is all about. It's not entirely clear. We can come back to that perhaps. But yes, they have F-18s is their primary strike weapon. And they also have the F-35 in the region. They've reopened Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico, which is a an old base I remember frequenting in the 90s. They've reopened that. So this is a huge re-emergence of military forces in the area.
You've written a piece for us that it adds 63% more ships, triples the fighter jets, doubles the Tomahawk land attack missiles, and increases deployable US Marine boots by almost half again. That does sound quite significant. That sounds like it will open up quite a lot more military options in Venezuela than were previously available to Trump.
It does open up options. I mean, it does come back to how much do you need for the end state? What is the end state? Again, unless we know that, which we don't, then it's very hard to know what the required amount of soldiers, sailors, Marines are at any given time. Like I say, for most of these missions, short of an invasion, this is overkill. They had enough in theatre already to do all that they need to do. If it's smashing up drug smuggling boats, they've got that in spades. We need to know what the plan is here to know whether this is overkill or not, because right now it feels like overkill. And then, what happens if you do that is that you increase the risk of miscalculation. The more military, the more forces you pack in there, the more there is a likelihood of someone misunderstanding something that's going on and taking preemptive action to protect themselves. And now you've created the problem that perhaps you were trying to solve, or at least deter by mistake.
When we covered this issue a couple of weeks ago on Battle Lines, the consensus view was that it wasn't enough. The US didn't have enough military assets to invade Venezuela. Is that still true?
That is the one thing where they would need more forces. It would be an invasion. And you do have to sort of remember a little bit with American planning that where's the carrier is question one. Something happens in the world. Where's the nearest carrier? How long will it take to get there? It's hardwired into the Pentagon, probably into the White House sort of psyche as well. So that's part of that is this. Just get the carrier there. You can always send them back. I mean, as Trump has said, it's at sea anyway. You can always send it back. It might just be contingency planning. The whole thing might be a massive distraction for everything else that's going on in the US right now.
What do you think is the most likely course of action that we're going to see in the next few weeks? We saw the US designating Cartel de los Solas, which is this drug trafficking circle that they say Maduro is the head of. They've designated them as a terrorist group, which will come into force on November 24th. Do we expect to see some kind of action after then? What do you think?
This is their free pass to start summarily executing these people. And I have to say that the blowing up of the drug boats at sea for me, is slightly problematic for two reasons. Firstly, I'm not sure it's legal. I mean, these discussions can go on. And of course, if you support it, then you'll just go, well, you're part of the problem. This sort of hand-wringing about legality is part of the problem. And I kind of get that. But question two is, will it work? Are you hitting the right people? If your actual intent is to stop the flow of drugs into America, then these solutions very rarely lie actually at sea. They lie inland, they lie with the smugglers, they lie with the cartels, they lie with the supply and demand. Smashing up the odd boat is a bit like hitting alcohol delivery lorries to try and stop alcoholism. It's not going to work. You've got to get to the source of it. That, to me, is perhaps more of a problem than the legality. But if you put them both together, then you can see why, some people are slightly uncomfortable with this. And in fact, the 4-star who ran Southern Command resigned. I mean, it's not 100% clear he resigned over this, but I think it's pretty obvious. So the labeling of narco-terrorists, again, a new term. Just yesterday, Maduro was labeled a terrorist. This is definitely setting the scene for whatever's next. And you asked me to guess whatever next is. I don't know. And I don't know anyone who genuinely does. You can go on about their relationship with China. You can go on about regime change, intimidation, rare earths, oil, of course, is never far away in these conversations. You can make a convincing case that this is about each of those. And then finally, the distraction from Epstein or whatever it is. You can make a case for all of those. So to actually say what's going to happen next is difficult.
You used to operate in the region against drug smugglers in the Caribbean, and you touched on there how difficult it is to try and tackle this kind of issue just by basically bombing the messenger. Can you talk a bit more about your experiences in that region and some of the sort of interconnected difficulties of how that works, drug trafficking over there?
It all starts with intelligence gathering. Without that, you have nothing. And so working with the US there, Jayatef South it was called, or the Dutch out of Curacao, you got these different intelligence products. So we would be at sea in a destroyer back when we had enough destroyers to be able to spare one to be permanently on station in the West Indies. Seems incredible now. But you'd have a destroyer in your own tanker and you would be there on call. You'd have a US law enforcement detachment on board, a LEDET, because generally speaking, military don't do constabulary tasks like that. So the ledet would be there to conduct the boardings and, if necessary, do the arrests. We were there essentially to get them to the right place at the right time. We had snipers in the helicopter so we could shoot out engines if one was of particular interest. And we did that quite a lot. We would intercept these fast runners. We would intercept larger boats with double hulls and drugs packed in between the two hulls. This was the way of doing it. And then you would arrest the crew, take them back to find out what information they had. And this is part of the intelligence network. So you get queued on, you go dashing towards it, you put your helicopter up, you board it. And if they are found to be smuggling drugs, then you detain them and arrest the crew through the ledet. That was the conventional way. Now, of course, the people in support of the new system said, well, it wasn't working. We've still got a massive drugs problem, hence this shift through the gears. It was a very fascinating task, very fast moving, quite punchy. You felt like you were doing something good, but it was very much based in the sort of constabulary ops. Detain, arrest, deter, not destroy, which is what it switched to. And I think that's what's had a lot of people who did it, the old way, scratching their heads a little bit.
How unprecedented is this idea of bombing drug smuggling boats to try and tackle them?
It's not unprecedented. No, I mean, the Americans had done it before. I think they did it in the 70s, actually. And of course, Obama famously was, in drone striking terrorists inland, which legally might be even more difficult by labeling them terrorists. So there are different tricks and ways around the Constitution that allow this on a presidential authority, which is where we are now. So those in favor of this are saying it's absolutely legal. Why do you keep questioning it? Whereas the lawyers I've spoken to back here in the UK are much less certain. So no, it's not unprecedented. This has to stop. The drugs have to stop. But the boats they're hitting, most of them are too small to make it very far. The one that got hit yesterday went up like an absolute sort of firecracker, suggesting it was probably carrying fuel, not drugs. I started this by talking about intelligence and the importance of intelligence. The one thing I do remember from my time doing this was, no intelligence network is 100% accurate. In fact, when it comes to the wider maritime domain, it's quite often a lot less than that. Now, Hollywood gives you this perception that someone has a God's eye view. That does not exist. So then you start getting into the problem of what are these boats doing? And are the people in them? Are they criminals? They probably are, but they're not the top dogs. And quite often they're sent out in these boats under duress, with their family essentially under threat. You to go from A to B, here's enough fuel, here's a radio, and go. These are not the targets, and yet these are the ones potentially being killed. And they might not even be smuggling fentanyl. There might be other drugs. It might be fuel. There's a lot of uncertainty. So again, just sort of blowing that up to try and resolve that, to me, is an interesting change in tactic.
Do you think that's why the UK stopped intelligence sharing with the US, the sorts of concerns you've mentioned?
Yeah, 100%. Now, intelligence agencies work in mysterious ways. Actually physically severing that intelligence, I don't know, but there is a chance that we've said we've done it because we need to be seen to say we've done it. But there'll still be back channels. I mean, we do have a good intelligence network out there because of our historical interest in parts of the region. To actually just cut that off right now, given everything else that's going on, would be an interesting geopolitical thing to do. So it's very possible that there is still intelligence going both ways. But yes, the we are stopping sharing intelligence with you is very much a sign that the UK government is not happy with the way this is progressing.
That was former Royal Navy officer and Telegraph columnist Tom Sharpe. Coming up after the break, is this the end for longtime dictator Nicolás Maduro? Welcome back. The US has a long and tangly history of regime change in Latin America, and it's long been known that Donald Trump does not like Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. He tried to oust him in his first term by backing an opposition leader, but it didn't work. Now his Secretary of State Marco Rubio is accusing Venezuela's government of colluding in drug trafficking, and his Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says Caracas is a threat to America. US troops are on standby for possible attack orders after Trump spent last week consulting about military options against Venezuela. This was him speaking to reporters on Air Force One late on Friday.
on Venezuela, sir. You've had a lot of meetings on Venezuela. I know you can't tell us what your next steps will be, but can you say, have you made up your mind on what you'd like to do for as far as action? For
I sort of have made up my mind, yeah. I mean, I can't tell you what it would be, but I sort of made up my mind.
So can the US oust Maduro through force? And what would be the spillover for the region? To answer that, I'm joined in the studio by Carlos Solar, a senior research fellow at RUSI and specialist in Latin American security. He's just returned from South America. Carlos, maybe we can start by asking, what was the temperature like on the ground? I know you were quite far from Venezuela, but how worried are people in the region?
Well, I was in Santiago, in Chile, so the farthest that you can be from Venezuela in terms of Latin American directions. People are very worried, mostly because Venezuela has been a hot issue for the last 15 years. It's not just about the military buildup that we've seen recently, but it's also about Venezuelan democracy, which has been a big theme in the region. It has been about migration as well. 8 million Venezuelans have been exploding out of Venezuela recently, both north into the US and south into countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. And then you also have an economic issue. The Venezuelan economy is in a downward spiral. Although they sit on top of massive reserves of oil, they are a powerhouse to the region. But under the administration of Nicolás Maduro, none of this has happened. So instead of having a powerhouse flourishing next to Colombia, next to Brazil, and so on, we have a country that has been mismanaged over the last 2 decades.
We'll get onto the sort of various scenarios that might unfold in the coming weeks. But if one of those scenarios to come to fruition was regime change, then is that something that would be welcomed by some countries in the region?
Yeah, I think the region stands 50-50, mostly because there are new presidents in different countries which are quite close to Donald Trump. So they are dealing on a bilateral basis with Washington in terms of what they need. So the Argentine economy has been benefited by dealing with Donald Trump and his administration. Then you have countries which have strong security problems, such as Ecuador or El Salvador, and they're both getting the help from Donald Trump. Then you have other countries such as Chile or Brazil or Mexico, which have kind of like sitting on the fence. Their relationships with the US have not been the best, mostly because they follow a very different political project to Donald Trump. So whatever happens in the region will be first analyzed under the eyes of international law. The lawmaking behind this operation in the Southern Caribbean has been quite shady or shaky. So I think there's going to be a lot of criticism if a military action takes place. This happened already in Panama, for instance. So when the U.S. had military action towards the Panamanian regime, it was decried all over the place. The Organization of American States, which is the political multilateral organization that holds all countries together, they were quite quick to react and to say the U.S. was wrong. I think that something similar will happen with Donald Trump, but that's just the paper. I think countries will go into elections. Chile has just had a first round of elections on Sunday. Colombia will go into elections on 2026. So Latin America politically is reshaping as well, which might bring it closer to Donald Trump. So although there might be something very, very against political action into Venezuela, I think the aftermath of those first actions, those first weeks, will be quite telling in terms of how Latin America reacts.
You mentioned the legal framework around Washington's attack on alleged drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean around Venezuela and Colombia. Trump says Maduro is the head of this narco-terrorist group, Cartel de Solos. How much truth is there to that claim? Some people suggest that this group doesn't even really exist. Where does the truth lie?
Well, let's start with the larger picture. The larger picture is nothing moves in Venezuela without Nicolás Maduro knowing about it, right? Or authorizing it, or at least turning a blind eye into whatever happens in Venezuela. So it's hard to see that such a large criminal organization such as the Tren de Aragua will actually be operating within Venezuela and towards the rest of the region without the complicity of the regime. In Venezuela, we have an autocratic regime for the last 15 years. So it's hard not to believe that Nicolás Maduro doesn't know anything about the drug trafficking within Venezuela and that stems out. On another level, the U.S. has such a large intelligence community. It has been put to the test before. It has been stressed. This recent administration is quite aware of how they deal with the intelligence community. But you cannot question that either the US or the UK or the Five Eyes don't know what's happening within Venezuela.
Maduro has been making himself out amidst all of this as a peacemaker, holding up V signs at his rallies. He even sang John Lennon's Imagine during a recent one. Let's hear a quick clip of that.
Imagine us people. Mira, son
What do you make of this image that he's trying to project? And how truthful is it?
Well, both Nicolás Maduro and Hugo Chávez use the power of rhetoric quite strongly, okay? Not just to be on the same level with countries such as Russia, China, Iran, countries that have good speakers as their main leaders, but it's also because that's a message towards the Venezuelan population. So you need to know that Maduro is an autocrat, so he's constantly thinking that something will happen to him. So he needs to be very close to people. He needs to be very close to the other leaders within the regime. He needs to have the armed forces very close. So he plays this figure of a president that goes out and says things like, the Americans are about to invade us. We need to hold on, Venezuela. This is our country and so on. That's just typical rhetoric of someone who's very cornered, but also needs to be in touch with the people because they're so fragile. Being an autocrat is such a fragile position, especially when you saw the opposition that you had, and especially because you have the U.S. largest aircraft in your coast. So it's not like you're dealing with Trump and he's sitting in Washington and you're in Caracas and everything is fine. But no, as soon as your economic exclusive zone ends, there's a carrier, there are B-52s bombardiers, there are F-35s, there's the Iwo Jima amphibious group section, which is quite powerful and so on. So Maduro is feeling the pressure.
How does Venezuela's armed forces match up to all of that? We know that Maduro has mobilized them, including reservists. What's he got to defend himself against the full might of the US Navy?
Well, there's no country that can support any of that. Okay, so we have to start with that base. Now, Venezuela used a lot of the money that they got from the oil in order to empower their armed forces. One of the main partners is Russia, but Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine, so they don't have too much spare. And whatever you have in Venezuela is getting old by the minute. Okay, so air power, surface-to-air missiles, they're quite good, they're Russian, but they're about to become obsolete. The armed forces are not necessarily well-trained. And everything that you got is basically a militia, which is called the Bolivarian militia, which is just plain people like you and me who have probably been to the barracks for training once a year. So it's quite funny in terms of how he's preparing these coastal defenses. He could inflict some power because basically any gun that you have could inflict some power. We've seen it in Latin America. The Argentinians fought a war against the UK and they caused some massive losses when both countries were quite dissimilar in terms of how much power they had in their weapons and arsenals. I think everyone is trying to avoid any type of military escalation because it will end up bad. And then on the other hand, the way that the US has been dealing with adversaries in the rest of the world has always been from a long distance. If you think the US against the Houthis or against Iran and so on, what they do is that they basically just send missiles very, very far away and they diminish losses by not exposing themselves to war, which I'm not sure it will be the scenario in Venezuela because they will have to go inland, for instance.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about the sort of possible scenarios. My colleague Joe Barnes did a really good run through of three of the most likely ones. And some of those you mentioned already: forced extradition, like in 1989 when the US forces went into Panama and hauled General Noriega back to Florida for trial on drug charges. Some similarities there with Maduro. A long-range bombing campaign, like you just mentioned. For example, in Libya, they toppled Gaddafi in 2011. Or some kind of CIA-led spy plot, like the one that was deployed to oust Iran's then Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1956. You said you don't think the long-range bombing campaign is very likely. What do you think is the likely scenario? And do you have any comments on those sort of three ideas?
I think they're all quite plausible. We know from recent comments by Nicolás Maduro that he's trying to get a phone call with Donald Trump. So I think Nicolás Maduro is trying to negotiate with Trump a way out of this, or at least to de-escalate the U.S. military presence in the Southern Caribbean. I'm not sure that Donald Trump is picking up the phone, but we never know with him. He's been having all these kind of declarations towards the press about Venezuela, but he's quite good at deflecting the problem and talking more broadly about drug trafficking and talking about Mexico and Colombia and so on. But I think the intention of Nicolás Maduro is to get a hold of Donald Trump, and that's not working. And if you see, Donald Trump has lines of communications with other so-called adversaries. So he picks up the phone and he talks to North Korea. He does the same with China. He's willing to meet with Russia. But he's not doing any of that with Venezuela. He's very far away from being close to Nicolás Maduro and actually engaging in something. Another theory is that Russia will try to intervene on this, and Nicolás Maduro could end up in Moscow with a few of his generals. You need to remember that Nicolás Maduro has a $50 million bounty on his head, and the same for some other people in the regime. So what they could do, they could give an amnesty and say, okay, I'm not going to blow you away, but I'm just going to send you back to Russia or some other country that might welcome you. There was a piece by CNN talking about Turkey as well. If we say that Nicolás Maduro will go into Russia, we need to start thinking, okay, so what else is the U.S. doing with Russia at the same time, right? So you have the Ukraine war. So how does the Venezuela piece now fit into dealing Trump vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin?
Russia wouldn't do it for nothing.
They wouldn't do it for nothing. So they will start, playing the cards of geopolitics, which is not just the Western Hemisphere. It will definitely involve Ukraine. If you think about China, it will definitely do about something about the Indo-Pacific and so on.
If there is military action, what do you think is the most likely form that's going to take?
We know how the U.S. operates, and they will try to, with a first wave of attacks, they try to destroy the coastal defenses, which are quite heavily armed today in Venezuela. They will go for airports and ports. They will try all military objectives. You'll be very selective in certain objectives, military objectives, and military targets that don't cause any civilian type of deaths, any civilian losses. You will try to get the Venezuelan arms as low as possible. So there isn't a retaliation attack by the Venezuelan F-16s or the Sukhoi that they have, or the coastal defenses, any missiles that can be thrown into, the aircraft carrier, the destroyers deployed. If you use the missiles, you will need to have some air capability by the U.S. So planes are always easy targets just because they're big and they need to get close and so on. So the U.S., I think it will try to be as far away as possible from that coastal defense of Venezuela in order to avoid losses, but try to create pressure and try to eliminate everything that currently sits within the coast of Venezuela.
If this did happen, as you mentioned, they'd be bombing a lot of different infrastructure, would presumably cause another exodus, another wave of people fleeing the country, which would have an impact on not just America, but South America. Are there any countries that are trying to lobby for Trump to hold back and stop and think for a second?
That's a great question. And it's great because it doesn't have a very plausible answer or anything that I have seen lately. So here, a key country, for instance, are the two neighbors. So Brazil on one end and then Colombia on the other. Both of those presidents are not having a very good moment with Donald Trump, mostly because Lula represents a very different political trajectory to Donald Trump. He's aiming towards more connection with the BRICS, for instance. His foreign policy is quite independent from what the U.S. does in Latin America. And then on the other end, you have Gustavo Petro in Colombia, which recently went to New York, and then he had this thing outside the UN, and then Donald Trump took his visa away. That relationship is really, really awry at the moment. It's not good. It's sour. Everyone in Colombia is just waiting for the elections next year. These countries could be buffers, and they could explain to the US what havoc it could create if something like a second wave of migration comes out, because people will be really scared if there are bombings in the coast of Venezuela. People will want to leave the city. Caracas will be very quiet because it could be a target. Every single government infrastructure in Caracas could be a target by the US forces. There's a lot of what's happening in this country, in the UK, for instance, in security and intelligence sharing. The UK is a big actor in the Caribbean. It's not a small actor. It's a big actor. They don't operate within Venezuela. They operate in Colombia. So all the interaction that they have with the US is through different channels. And if, UK intelligence is disconnected from that system, then you basically just have the US taking decisions and not very much engaging with the rest of the region in terms of potential secondary effects of military intervention in Venezuela.
I saw that Colombia has just announced a deal to buy Swedish warplanes, describing it as a deterrent weapon to achieve peace. Is the region rearming? Is the sort of instability that we're seeing here in Europe, is that being felt too in Latin America?
Yes, for two reasons. One is that because we always see cycles in defense spending. Most countries were quite delayed in terms of new air capacity, new sea capacity with new OPVs and frigates and submarines and so on.
OPV, offshore patrol vessels.
Yes, sea capacity, yes. So different countries are buying, mostly because it's also a geopolitical moment to buy. If you have someone who's willing to sell, for instance, the Argentinian bought the F-16s because the Danish, they needed to renew their fleet, so they needed a buyer, and the Argentinians were, over the last 5 years at least, trying to have a multi-role jet fighter, and then now they have the F-16s. Peru is trying to get the OPVs, and they went with South Korea. So quite a different partner, not North American, not European, but Asian. Signs of geopolitics, of a hot world, of conflict happening. Another hot topic at the moment is Antarctica. So most countries are trying to get a little bit of a polar connection with the icebreakers. So a lot happening in South America.
Pete Hegseth suggested that because the Western Hemisphere is America's neighbourhood, they have a right to protect themselves from narco-terrorists and therefore sort of justifying a potential Venezuelan military intervention. Is this the return of this sphere of influence, geopolitics, the sort of Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think it makes sense with Donald Trump's policy of America first, and we're going to protect the homeland. So it wouldn't make sense, again, rhetorically, if you're going to protect just the U.S. without thinking of what's beneath you, both oceans that you have on each side, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, without looking at the U.S. and their interests in the Arctic or in the Antarctic, without looking at new partners that are coming up because of elections. The region is turning towards the center-right and the far-right. So those are good signs for the U.S. when it comes to, okay, let's start with the Western Hemisphere. Now there is momentum and we have partners and we have a common adversary. Well, it's not seen as a common adversary in the rest of Latin America, but I'm talking about China, all right? So China is an adversary for the U.S., but for the rest of Latin America, it represents economic opportunity. It represents a partner that doesn't do too much judgment about what you do in international relations. And at the moment, it represents, out of the three superpowers, the US, China, and Russia, it's the only one who's not at war with anyone, right? So China is also getting the advantage of all of this by saying, hey, look, you know, we are quite trustful partners. We give you opportunities towards development, and we're not very judgeful when it comes to international relations or the multilateral system.
That was Carlos Solar, a senior research fellow at RUSI. That's all for today's episode of Battle Lines. We'll be back again on Friday. Until then, goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.